Welcome to the deep dive.
Yeah.
Today, we're going deep into early colonial America, specifically Jamestown. You sent over this episode of the American History Tellers podcast.
Yeah.
And wow, there's just so much to unpack there. Like, we're going to uncover the just unbelievable hardships these early colonists faced.
Right.
Look deeper at the story of Pocahontas and really examine the complicated legacy Jamestown left on American history, both the good and the bad.
You know, it's fascinating because it really highlights just how difficult it was to establish a colony in a new world.
Yeah.
And those interactions between the colonists and the indigenous people already here.
Yeah, it's, right from the start in 1607, it seems like Jamestown was just constantly on the verge of collapse.
Oh, yeah.
The podcast really paints this stark picture of disease and starvation and conflict with the Powhatan Confederacy.
Yeah.
I mean, how did anyone survive the starving time?
I mean, that starving time of 1609 to 1610,
Yeah.
it really just shows how unprepared the colonists were. You know, you can imagine their dependence on supplies from England,
Right.
which were delayed, really magnified those already harsh conditions.
Yeah.
Makes you appreciate how fragile these early settlements were.
It really does. And speaking of appreciating, you can't talk about those early days without talking about John Smith.
Right.
What were some of the specific things he did that allowed the colony to survive?
He understood that discipline, forging, and establishing trade relations with the Powhatan, despite the tension there, was crucial to their survival during those first few years.
Yeah.
He really stepped up as a leader when the colony needed it.
Yeah, it's interesting how the podcast really challenges some of those romanticized versions we have of early colonial life, especially with Pocahontas. I mean, what do we actually know about her experience? Like, what might she have been thinking?
The podcast, what it does is it really sheds light on the fact that her abduction by the colonists in 1613 might have been more complex than we think. It suggests that her father, Chief Powhatan, might have viewed her captivity as a strategic opportunity for her to gather intelligence on the English.
Whoa, that completely changes the narrative, doesn't it?
It really does. And it gets even more complex when you consider that Pocahontas wasn't a stranger to the colonists.
Right.
She had interacted with them, including John Smith, from a young age, and even participated in trade negotiations.
So she was somewhat familiar with their culture and customs.
Exactly.
That must have been somewhat helpful.
It really suggests that she wasn't simply a naive girl thrown into a foreign world.
Right.
The podcast emphasizes her intelligence and agency, even highlighting her anger towards her father for prioritizing weapons over her return.
Wow.
She actually states a preference for living with the English who, quote, loved her.
That's such a powerful statement.
Yeah.
Makes you wonder about the internal conflict she must have been going through.
Yeah.
And then there's the arrival of John Rolfe and the introduction of tobacco. It almost feels like a turning point for Jamestown.
When Rolfe introduced a sweeter variety of tobacco in 1612, it transformed the colony.
Right.
Suddenly, they had a product in huge demand in England.
Yeah.
It provided the economic lifeline they so desperately needed.
But as we all know, that reliance on tobacco would shape the colony's social fabric.
Oh, yeah.
In some deeply troubling ways.
The long-term consequences of relying on a single cash crop.
Right.
And the labor system that would come to depend on, certainly not foreseen at that time.
And this landmark year, 1619, holds even deeper significance.
Yeah.
It marks the birth of democracy in America.
That's right. The creation of the first representative assembly in the Western Hemisphere happened right there in Jamestown.
Wow.
It was a direct response to the colony's need for stability and to attract new settlers.
So the Virginia Company, realizing they needed a change, decided to give the colonists a voice in their own governance. That must have been a huge shift.
Oh, yeah. The General Assembly, meeting for the first time in that Jamestown church, debated laws, addressed grievances, set an incredibly important precedent for self-government in America.
But this is where things get complicated.
Yes.
The same year that witnesses this leap forward in democracy.
Right.
Also marks the beginning of one of the most horrific chapters in American history.
It's such a stark juxtaposition.
Yeah.
In late August of 1619, the White Lion, a privateer ship, arrives carrying, quote, 20 and odd Negroes.
Wow.
Seized from a Portuguese slave ship.
Wow.
These individuals were traded for provisions.
Yeah.
And just like that, the institution of slavery was introduced to Virginia. It's hard to reconcile those two events happening in the same year.
Yeah.
Really makes you think about the complexities of history and how these huge moments of progress can happen at the same time as the seeds of injustice.
Yeah, the podcast does mention that slavery didn't fully take hold right away.
Right.
It developed gradually.
Right. And indentured servitude was the main source of labor for decades.
Yeah.
But still, the arrival of those first enslaved Africans in 1619, it's just this chilling foreshadowing of what's to come.
It really shows you how that groundwork for a system of exploitation that would define Virginia was already being laid.
And just when you think the colony might be finding some stability, it's hit with that devastating massacre of 1622.
Oh, yeah.
Pocahontas, Powhatan's brother and successor, orchestrated this brutal attack, what led to this eruption of violence.
Well, the podcast explains that Pocahontas, frustrated by the continued encroachment of the English onto Powhatan lands, carefully planned this coordinated attack.
Wow.
The Powhatan took advantage of that trust and launched this surprise assault, killing nearly a third of the English population.
It was a major setback for Jamestown. And a stark reminder of that underlying tension.
How did this impact the relationship moving forward?
Well, the massacre really shattered any pretense of peaceful coexistence. The English retaliated brutally. Launched raids on Powhatan villages, declaring what they called, quote, perpetual war.
Wow.
The cycle of violence escalated.
And this really exposed the vulnerabilities of the Virginia Company, right?
Exactly.
I mean, the massacre, combined with their financial struggles and the high death rates in the colony, led to their downfall.
The Crown, already concerned by reports of instability and chaos in Virginia, saw the massacre as the final straw. They launched an investigation, and the findings were damning. They painted a picture of widespread poverty, disease, and ongoing conflict.
So it's clear the Virginia Company's dream of a profitable and peaceful colony had failed.
It had.
So in 1624, King James revoked the Virginia Company's charter and took direct control. This was a huge turning point in how England would manage its colonies.
Absolutely. And while the Virginia Company ultimately failed, they laid the groundwork for future colonization.
Even though there was so much hardship, Jamestown had proved that a permanent English settlement was possible.
It had.
But that conflict with the Powhatan didn't just disappear.
Sadly, no.
It did.
The fighting continued for years as the English expanded and displaced indigenous people.
Yeah, it's a dark chapter that shows the consequences of colonization.
Absolutely.
And all this time, tobacco remained a driving force. The need for labor to cultivate and harvest this cash crop fueled the colony's development.
It did.
But led to a heavy reliance on indentured servitude. And increasingly the enslavement of Africans.
The podcast highlights how that tobacco boom created this insatiable demand for labor that would have such a profound consequences. We can trace the roots of that system right back to this period.
So when we zoom out and look at the big picture, what's the lasting impact of Jamestown?
Well, Jamestown offers a glimpse into the beginnings of English America.
It's a story of incredible resilience.
It is.
In the face of unimaginable challenges.
Yes, but it also forces us to confront the realities of colonization.
The displacement of indigenous people.
Yes, and the origins of slavery.
Yeah, the podcast does a great job of driving that home. The colonists came here with dreams of wealth and a new life. But those ambitions came at a terrible cost.
The story of Jamestown reminds us that history is rarely straightforward. It's a mix of ambition and ingenuity, but also greed, violence, and consequences.
The events of 1619 really highlight that complexity. You have the first representative assembly, this landmark moment for democracy, happening at the same time as the arrival of those first enslaved Africans. The seeds of freedom and oppression. It's planted in the same year.
It's a jarring contrast that asks us to think critically about our history and understand how progress can exist alongside troubling events.
And those contradictions continue to shape America.
Absolutely. How do we reconcile those triumphs of Jamestown with the darker parts of its legacy?
It's a lot to consider.
It is.
And Jamestown is more than just this small colony.
It's a microcosm of the larger forces that would shape America.
Right.
The drive for expansion.
The development of a new society.
And the ongoing struggle for freedom and equality.
And even though Jamestown was abandoned, its legacy lives on.
It's present in the political institutions that we have.
Right.
And in that complex relationship between settlers and indigenous people that continues to this day.
It's amazing to think that something so small could have such a lasting impact.
It really speaks to the power of human ambition.
Right.
For better or for worse.
Right.
And it shows how important it is to understand our history. So we can work towards a more just and equitable future.
So Jamestown becomes a cautionary tale, wouldn't you say?
I think so.
It reminds us that progress isn't linear.
Yeah.
And even good intentions can have unintended consequences.
Absolutely. It's a powerful reminder that we need to be vigilant
in
upholding those democratic ideals and challenging oppression wherever it pops up.
Jamestown might be gone, but those questions it raises about power, ambition, and legacy are still with us.
It reminds us we're all part of this story.
Right.
And we can shape what comes next.
Yeah, it really makes you think about how those early decisions, I mean, both the positive and negative ones, still affect us.
Absolutely. And it highlights the importance of understanding history from different perspectives.
Right.
We need to look beyond those traditional narratives.
Yeah.
Really grapple with the complexities and contradictions in the American story.
I think this podcast does a great job at presenting those different perspectives, especially with the colonists and the Powhatan. We hear about the cooperation, like the trading, the peace agreement after Pocahontas and John Rolfe.
Yeah.
But we also hear about the distrust and resentment that led to the violence.
It's a much more nuanced picture than we often see. You can see how those misunderstandings, competition for resources, and the power dynamics of colonization all created this volatile situation.
Yeah, and it's a reminder that Jamestown isn't just about the English colonists.
Right.
It's about the indigenous people who are already living there.
Absolutely.
Whose lives were changed forever.
It's so important to remember that the Powhatan were a complex society with their own history, culture, and political systems.
Right.
They were active participants, not just passive victims.
Their story deserves to be told.
It does.
So, as we wrap up our deep dive into Jamestown, I'm kind of left with a sense of awe at just how resilient those early colonists were.
Yeah.
But also a sadness about the consequences.
Yeah, I share those feelings. It's a story that brings up a lot of emotions.
Yeah.
We admire their perseverance, but we also feel this responsibility to acknowledge the injustices.
Right.
And to learn from them.
It shows that history isn't something that happened in a vacuum.
Right.
It's still with us today.
Absolutely. And it really underscores that we all have a role to play in shaping that legacy.
This deep dive has been fascinating.
It has.
I feel like we've gained a deeper understanding of this really important moment in American history.
A moment that still shapes our world.
Yeah.
It challenges us to think critically about our past, embrace the complexity, and use that knowledge to create a better future.
And for everyone listening, think about this. How does Jamestown still impact us today?
Yeah.
What surprised you about this story? The deep dive is all about exploring and asking questions.
Keep learning.
Thanks for joining us.